On the first morning after his inauguration, the first document that's placed into Lincoln's hands is a letter from Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Here you can see Washington and Charleston down in the South. Not only is Charleston, as I had described in the previous lecture, surrounded by Confederate troops, but so is Fort Pickens in the Pensacola area of Florida. Both of these forts were federal forts. Both forts were set up offshore in harbor entryways, and so they're difficult for the Confederates to take over, and so they're just holding out as long as they can, as long as their food and provisions will last. Anderson, in his letter, writes that he has about 26 days of provisions left in Fort Sumter, and that obviously they're going to run out long before any kind of planned relief mission could reach them. Attached to Anderson's letter is as well a comment from Winfield Scott, the commander-in-chief of the United States Army. Quote, "I now see no alternative but a surrender." Scott is arguing that this fort should be surrendered for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that he, of course, feels that he can't get this fort relieved in time, not within 26 days that Anderson says he has left. Moreover, Scott believes that the southern states could still be talked into returning back into the Union. And so he feels that if they try to relieve the fort, bring supplies in, it would actually provoke the Confederates into going to war. Scott himself is America's longest serving general, having held that rank for over 50 years. He had been born way back in 1786. He was a lawyer who became a regular U.S. Army officer in 1808. He fought at Queenston Heights here in Canada in the War of 1812. He was captured there by the British. He was exchanged for Canadian British prisoners and then again fought in the Niagara region in 1814 in the Battle of Lundy's Lane, where he was wounded. During the Mexican-American War, Scott commanded the southern of the two United States armies. Zachary Taylor commanded the Northern Army. Again, this campaign, Scott kind of devised this U.S. military doctrine that would be used in future wars to outflank the enemy by landing Marines on the shores. When Scott lands at Veracruz in Mexico, he's assisted by his colonel of engineers, Robert E. Lee. Scott now, however, is aged. He can't even climb up on his horse. He's overweight. He needs to be actually lifted up into the saddle of his horse, and he's known by a nickname, Old Fuss and Feathers. So Lincoln now calls Scott into a meeting and asks Scott what is it that he actually requires to resupply Fort Sumter. Scott reminds Lincoln that the Confederates are easily assembling a 100,000 man army from all the various state militias that have been training quite intensively since John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and that the federal army has about 17 to 18,000 regular troops, and most of them are deployed in the West, fighting in the Indian Wars there. Scott says he would require about 6 to 8 months to assemble a fleet of vessels and transports, and an additional 5,000 regular troops and 20,000 volunteers. Well, this is not good news for Lincoln. Not everyone agrees with Scott's assessment. One of Lincoln's cabinet members, Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General, has a brother-in-law, Gustavus Fox. Gustavus Fox is a former naval officer with experience in the Mexican-American War. And Fox proposes a plan where 2 tugboats would attempt to resupply Fort Sumter, and these tugboats would be shadowed by a large high-speed steamer with Union troops aboard, ready to intervene if the tugs are attacked by the Confederates. Lincoln's cabinet is almost unanimously opposed to this idea. They fear that any kind of move to resupply Fort Sumter is going to provoke the South into open warfare with the North. Blair argues the opposite. He tells Lincoln, quote, "Every conquest made by the rebels strengthens their hand at home and their claim to recognition as an independent people abroad. So as long as the rebels can claim that the Northern men are deficient in the courage necessary to maintain the government, the secession momentum will continue." Lincoln is worried, indeed, that the Confederacy is going to be recognized in Europe, particularly by the British and the French. As things stand, this is kind of an internal issue for the United States. However, if the Confederacy is recognized as an independent nation, suddenly it's a whole different scenario where we're talking about a kind of conventional war where you have 2 sovereign belligerents. If France, Spain, Britain recognizes the Confederacy, the United States will have to face all sorts of diplomatic issues and the potential of the Confederacy picking up allies. We already know that Britain is very much dependent on Southern cotton, and the threat of Southern cotton supplies to the textile industry in Britain is a serious one, considering how many people are involved in working in the textile industry. It could be kind of a social catastrophe, certainly in Britain. William Seward leads the opposition. Seward has already, again, from last lecture, has persuaded Lincoln to moderate his inaugural speech. And now he is arguing that without conciliatory policies of the recent period, that the border states of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and other states like North Carolina and Arkansas that had still not seceded would join the South. Only Northern moderation keeps them in the Union. And so he advises that Fort Sumter be evacuated and surrendered to the Confederates. Throughout this period, In March, Seward, historians say, has been acting under what they'll call, quote, two supreme illusions. First, that Lincoln is weak and that Lincoln is an idiot, and that he, Seward, is really in charge. Seward saw himself as a prime minister to a figurehead presidency of Lincoln. A year earlier, Seward had told a German diplomat, quote, that there was no great difference between an elected president of the United States and a hereditary monarch. Neither truly ran things. The actual direction of public affairs belongs to the leader of the ruling party, end of quote. And of course, Seward considers himself as the leader of the Republican Party. The second supreme illusion is that Southerners could be appeased by the abandonment of Fort Sumter and would eventually return to the Union. The Confederate States in March had actually sent ambassadors or commissioners to Washington to negotiate issues like that of the federal forts and other federal facilities, post offices, armories, and so forth that are in their territories. They want to negotiate the transfer of former U.S. federal facilities now to the Confederacy. Lincoln refuses to meet with them or even recognize them. Moreover, many Unionists in the South, and there are Unionists in the South, not all Southerners unanimously support the secession. There are many Southerners that think the South would be better remaining in the Union, and they too have a dislike for Lincoln, who appears to be unwilling to compromise. And many Southern Unionists refer to Lincoln as a third-rate man, while they describe Seward in letters to him as, for example, quote, Atlas of not only his cabinet, but the giant intellect of the whole North. Another letter written to Seward swears that, quote, Unionists look to yourself and only to you, sir, as a member of a cabinet to save this country, end of quote. And so Seward believes and comments that Lincoln, quote, has no conception of his situation, much absorption in the details of office dispensation, but little application to great ideas. He's not equal to the hour, end of quote. Seward sets up his own lines of communication to the Confederacy behind Lincoln's back through a Supreme Court justice from Alabama who remains sitting on the court, John Campbell. And so as Seward is urging Lincoln to evacuate Fort Sumter, Seward is completely convinced that Lincoln will listen to him, that he's in charge of Lincoln. And so Seward now sends a message to the South through the Confederate ambassadors that Fort Sumter, quote, would be evacuated within 5 days. As late as March 28th, General Scott recommends the evacuation of both Fort Pickens and Sumter, saying, quote, the evacuation of both forts would instantly soothe and give confidence to the 8 remaining slaveholding states and render their cordial adherence to this union perpetual. One issue, of course, is the states that have already seceded. The other issue is that not all Southern states, and particularly Virginia, have still held back from seceding from the United States. And so everybody is urging Lincoln to behave in a way in which these states, further states, won't secede and hope that they can actually bring back into the Union. Seward, as I say, thinks Lincoln is following his advice. Yet on March 29th, George Harrington, the Assistant Secretary of State, drops by Seward's house in the evening to have him sign some important state papers. And to Seward's shock, Harrington comments that, quote, it was finally determined with the president's approval to reinforce Fort Sumter, end of quote. And Seward just goes ballistic, screaming, "Great thunder, George, what are you talking about? It cannot be." Seward doesn't realize that Gustavus Fox and his tugboats have already left for Fort Sumter and were prepared to rendezvous just offshore from Fort Sumter with a military vessel with troops aboard that was going to follow them and cover their resupply mission once in Charleston Harbor. This is, of course, one of the fastest steamboats the Union has, the USS Powhatan. Seward now approaches Lincoln and tries to talk him, if he has to resupply a fort, tries to talk him out of resupplying Fort Sumter, and instead, why don't you resupply Fort Pickens in Florida? It would be less provocative, but it would still serve to symbolize federal determination and show their authority, Seward argues. Lincoln is hesitant. Seward then makes this crazy proposal. Why not instead invade Canada? This, he says, would unite the country against a foreign enemy. We don't know how Lincoln responded to Seward, but very likely he responded saying, one war at a time. We're in no shape to go invading Canada, which of course would mean immediately a war with Britain, as Canada is at this point in 1961 still a colony of Great Britain. Lincoln reminds Seward of his inaugural address, that his policy is quite clear and simple. Quote, the power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, end of quote. And this, in fact, was the same domestic policy that Seward himself called for, with the single exception that it does not propose to abandon Fort Sumter. Now, Seward has swung away the other day. And so the idea of starting a foreign war to deflect American attentions elsewhere in an attempt of unification, we really don't know what Lincoln said to Seward, but the idea just dies. So Seward now takes it upon himself to organize an army expedition to Fort Pickens, to relieve Fort Pickens, in the hope that he can persuade Lincoln to forget relieving Fort Sumter, but let's go and do Fort Pickens. Seward's dismay, once Lincoln reads Seward's plan to relieve Fort Pickens in the South, Lincoln says, this is great. Let's relieve both forts. And so Seward is just frustrated. Fort Pickens had actually been already attacked by the Alabama and Florida militia back in January 8th, 1861. Some argue that had actually been the first battle of the Civil War, although it didn't really result in any shots being fired or any casualties. January 9th, the next day, you actually get the first shots fired. South Carolina artillery fires on a Union ship attempting to resupply Fort Sumter, and it scores a hit on the ship, forcing the ship to turn around and leave without supplying the fort. That, too, could be argued to be the first shot of the Civil War. And there were probably other skirmishes that were lost to history, but officially the war had still not begun. And of course, in January, Lincoln wasn't even president. It was Buchanan. And so immediately after that shot is fired at a U.S. Navy vessel off the shores of Fort Sumter, President Buchanan and the Confederates call a truce. 9 former senators, now Confederate officials, including Jefferson Davis, guarantee that no attack would be made on Fort Pickens. And Buchanan now promised not to land any further troops to reinforce Fort Pickens. About 50 years ago now, Charles W. Ramsdo starts a debate among historians as to the question, who really started the Civil War, which becomes known as the Ramsdo Thesis. And the Ramsdo Thesis goes like this, quote, Lincoln, having decided that there was no other way than war for the salvation of his administration, his party, and the Union, maneuvered the Confederates into firing the first shot in order that they, rather than he, should take the blame of beginning the bloodshed. End of quote. A generation of historians argued the opposite, that it was Jefferson Davis who started the war, that the life of the Confederacy depended upon going to war with the Union along with its pride and prestige. As one historian points out, after all, Lincoln did not order the guns to fire, Davis did. Some historians argue that Lincoln wanted to preserve the status quo, to give the policy of voluntary reconstruction, in other words, voluntary return to the United States, a chance, but that he feared that giving up Sumter would discredit the U.S. government and give the Confederacy legitimacy in the international sphere. According to these historians, Lincoln hoped to preserve peace and devised the resupply plan in a way that would give the Confederacy a choice between going to war or staying in a peaceful relationship. Lincoln would have been happy to keep the peace, but expected the Confederacy to open fire anyway. In determining what happened at Fort Sumter, Grady McWhinney writes in his book, Confederate Crackers and Cavaliers, quote, what has been neglected, what historians have missed, is how events at Fort Sumter were determined by what happened and by what failed to happen at Fort Pickens. According to McWhinney, by early March, both Lincoln and Davis had already secretly decided to violate the truths, except neither knew of the intention of the other. On March 10th, Confederate General Braxton Bragg takes command of Southern forces near Pensacola, Florida, and he receives instructions from the Confederate War Department to memo them on his requirements in, quote, respect to artillery and the munitions of war, having in view the destruction of Fort Pickens, end of quote. Towards the end of March, we now know that Lincoln has decided to send these 2 missions to resupply the forts, to ease the political pressure he's feeling at home to do something. And now we have these conspiratorial operations in the planning of the relief of Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens. Fort Sumter, that relief mission, of course, planned by Gustavus Fox, a naval officer, is planned in the Navy Department. The relief mission of Fort Pickens is planned in the War Department, which oversees the Army. Seward advises Lincoln not to inform the Navy of the Army mission to Fort Pickens. The reason being is that the U.S. Navy is based in Norfolk, Virginia, and being based in Virginia, which is a slave state and, of course, likely to secede any moment, Seward doesn't trust the U.S. Navy. So he wants to just keep it within the confines of supervision by the Army. On Seward's request, Lincoln orders the USS Powhatan, the Union's most powerful ship, to be released to the Army mission to Fort Pickens without the Navy being told about this mission. And so in this flurry of secretive orders and all the paperwork that Lincoln has to deal with anyhow, Lincoln misses that he had already previously assigned the Powhatan to the naval mission at Fort Sumter a few days earlier. And so the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, cuts orders on April 5th now for the Powhatan to proceed to Fort Sumter and meet Gustavus Fox just off Fort Sumter without realizing that the president had deployed it to Fort Pickens. The next day, on April 6th, Lincoln now sends a letter to the governor of South Carolina that the United States is underway to resupply Fort Sumter. And if they're allowed to proceed without being attacked, they would not unload any additional men or ammunition, only food, water, and supplies to the troops already stationed at Sumter. So now there's nothing secret about the mission to Sumter. The Confederacy now knows that Fort Sumter is about to be relieved. In the meantime, as Gustavus Fox's tugboats with the supplies are arriving off Fort Sumter, they're waiting for a Powhatan to arrive. And of course, it's not arriving because it's on the way to Fort Pickens. And so late at night, Seward and the Army officials realize the error. And so now Seward has to go to Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, and tell him that he and Lincoln had already secretly deployed the Powhatan to Fort Pickens. Seward now sends a telegraphed order that a high-speed boat will bring over to the Powhatan with orders signed by Seward to abandon the mission to Fort Pickens and turn back and head for Fort Sumter and rendezvous there with Gustavus Fox's tugs. The problem is that the captain of the Powhatan is carrying orders signed by President Lincoln. And so he now has these two sets of conflicting orders. He's got to weigh which order is going to have priority. And so he figures, well, President of the United States is of higher rank than the Secretary of State, Seward. And so he ignores Seward's order and continues sailing towards Pensacola. And in the meantime, Fox remains off the coast of Fort Sumter, waiting for the tugs that won't arrive. The president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, in the meantime, is under huge political pressure to do something as well. As one Mobile, Alabama newspaper complains, quote, "The spirit and even the patriotism of the people is oozing out under this do-nothing policy. If something is not done, Pretty soon, the whole country will become so disgusted with the sham of Southern independence that the first chance the people get at a popular election, they will turn the whole movement topsy-turvy. End of quote. Jefferson has to assert his attempt to now lead the CSA out of the Union. Jefferson writes a letter on April 3rd to General Bragg, in charge of the Confederate units at Pensacola. In the letter, he says that while hoping that the U.S. will take the first shot, other considerations are pressing the Confederacy to attack Fort Pickens, but only if Bragg can guarantee that he can take and hold the fort. Jefferson Davis does not want to take the first shot and then fail in taking this port and end up now being kind of the villain in terms of who started the Civil War. As Jefferson Davis writes to Bragg, he says, quote, "It is scarcely to be doubted that for political reasons the U.S. government will avoid making an attack so long as the hope of retaining the border states remains. There would be to us an advantage in so placing them that an attack by them would be a necessity. But when we're ready to relieve our territory and jurisdiction of the presence of a foreign garrison, that advantage is overbalanced by other considerations." The case of Pensacola, then, is reduced to a more palpable element of a military problem, and your measures may, without disturbing views, be directed to the capture of Fort Pickens and the defense of the harbor. April 7th, Bragg now responds to Jefferson Davis's letter. Bragg says he's not ready to attack Fort Pickens and guarantee that he can take the fort. He warns Davis that if he orders him to attack Fort Pickens and fires the first shot, he might be branded as an aggressor without any kind of tangible gain to show for it. And right about then, that letter, of course, from Lincoln had arrived announcing his intentions to resupply Fort Sumter. And so now Jefferson Davis really has no choice. April 10th, Davis now orders Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard, in charge of Confederate forces at Charleston, to demand that Anderson surrender Fort Sumter before it can get resupplied. And in some ways, this first opening battle of the Civil War, this bombardment, really represents what it means to its military. Beauregard is actually a former West Point student of Major Anderson. Anderson was Beauregard's artillery instructor at West Point. And in fact, Beauregard was such a talented artillery officer that Anderson kept him at West Point for another year as his teaching assistant in artillery. And so now, former professor and his student are facing each other as enemies at Charleston. And so both, as Fox and Anderson wait in vain for something to for the Powhatan to arrive to back them up at Fort Sumter, at 4:30 a.m. April 12th, Beauregard gives the order to open fire, and Fort Sumter now comes under bombardment, and the Civil War officially now begins. April 12th, 1861, 4:30 a.m. At the same hour, down in Pensacola, as Bragg now is forced to storm Fort Pickens, Union ships arrive and disembark additional troops and artillery. And Bragg is now forced to call off his attack at Fort Pickens. And Fort Pickens will now remain in Union hands right throughout the whole war. The Confederacy never gets Fort Pickens. After 2 days of bombardment, Fort Sumter surrenders and is occupied now by the Confederacy. And the next day, April 15th, Lincoln now issues a mobilization order calling for 75,000 Northern militiamen to mobilize for 90 days military service. That's how long everyone thinks this conflict is going to last, about 90 days. The Union is essentially convinced that in 90 days they'll put down this rebellion. Free states like Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania will now enthusiastically raise troops for the Union cause. The upper southern states that had not joined the Confederacy yet are less enthusiastic. You can read in McPherson's book in chapter 9, how Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri refused to mobilize their militias in the Union cause. The fall of Fort Sumter is celebrated in Virginia by anti-Unionists. And on April 17th, the Virginia legislature now voted to secede. This, of course, is a disaster for the Union because Virginia had the South's largest population, and the industrial capacity of Virginia was nearly as great as the other 7 Confederate states combined. Here you can see Virginia. The citizens of Western Virginia had been reluctant to secede. And the Virginian legislature would then hold a kind of referendum. Everyone will vote on that decision as well. And certainly in Eastern Virginia, in Tidewater, Virginia, coastal Virginia, people support the secession. But West Virginia, as I had pointed out earlier, there weren't a lot of slaves there. They often felt themselves closer to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, rather than to Richmond, the capital of Virginia. In fact, they were geographically closer. They had economic ties. The terrain there, it's coal mining, which of course was necessary for the emerging steel factories at Pittsburgh to fire the steel, the iron. And so in West Virginia, people essentially are against the secession. And of course, West Virginia will break away from Virginia, and in 1863, West Virginia, in the middle of the war, will be admitted into the Union as a separate state. And Union troops will as well very quickly occupy West Virginia to protect it from the Confederacy. The biggest loss, of course, to the United States are the first thing is, of course, is that Washington now is trapped between Maryland, which also might secede and is a slave state, and of course Virginia, a secessional state, just borders on Washington D.C., is just across the river from Washington, D.C. So that's a problem, certainly, and will be throughout the war, that the Confederacy is just bordering on Washington, D.C. The other problem, of course, there's the capital of Richmond. So the capital of Virginia, Richmond, and Richmond will very quickly become the permanent capital of the Confederacy. It'll move up from Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, and you have a mere 100 miles separating the two enemy capitals. The other problem are the Gosford Naval Yards at Norfolk, Virginia, still today's major Atlantic U.S. naval base, also the U.S. Navy's shipyards. And Lincoln did not want to provoke Virginia by seizing control of the Norfolk yards with Union troops. But many of Virginia's naval officers were certainly sympathetic to the secession, and in those days, people felt sometimes a greater loyalty to their state than they did to the country. And so many of them feel there's great loyalty to the state of Virginia, and that's a problem. And so at Norfolk, they kind of attempted not to provoke the officers and workers at the Gosford Yards, but now it's too late. And so at the last minute, the U.S. attempts to set fire to the U.S. naval fleet at the Norfolk base, but they fail. They burn the decks of the ship, but they fail to burn the hulls. And so some of these hulls now are going to be converted by the Confederates. They'll be clad in iron, and they'll become the first ironclads in naval history. In the meantime, the Virginia militia now begins to move forward and seize the Springfield Rifle Factory at Harper's Ferry. And of course, this is where John Brown had attempted his slave revolt. Once Virginia secedes in May of 1861, other states will follow. Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee now all vote for secession and seize federal arsenals, forts, and other facilities. These states had an extensive slave system and a strong secessionist movement, so their departure now to the Confederate States is not a surprise. It's in Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri where the secessionist factions were powerful, but a minority. And there the stakes were the largest. Together, the states of Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri represented 45% of potential Confederate white population and consequently military manpower, as African Americans were not permitted to fight in the Confederate Army. And these three states essentially represented 80% of the Confederacy's industrial capacity and 40% of the supply of horses and mules. Maryland is crucial. Maryland surrounds Washington, D.C. on three sides. If Maryland joins the Confederacy, with Virginia on the other side having seceded, essentially Washington, D.C. could not survive as a Union capital. It would find itself trapped in Confederate territory, completely surrounded. Maryland has a large Southern states' rights movement, particularly in the capital, in Baltimore, where a third of the state's population lives. Maryland had voted for Southern Democrats, and the formal secession, in fact, the legislature um, will vote for secession, except the only thing that's stopping it is the stubborn resistance of Maryland's pro-union governor to call the state legislature together. In Baltimore, the mayor and chief of police are strongly pro-Confederate, and Confederate flags fly all over the city of Baltimore. And of course, it's in Baltimore that Lincoln was supposed to have been assassinated on his way to take his office in Washington. A week after Fort Sumter, on April 19th, a volunteer regiment of Union militia from Massachusetts on its way to Washington, D.C., had to pass through Baltimore. They would have to march from one railway station to another. And so as this volunteer regiment of Union militia is passing through Baltimore on April 19th, they're attacked. 4 soldiers and 12 Baltimoreans are killed. And some argue that the Baltimore riots are actually the first kind of land battle, or the first fatalities that the Union side is going to suffer in this opening war. So, with increasing Union troops deployed in Maryland to protect its railway system, the state legislature finally meets, but while they refuse to condone the war against the South, Maryland votes now not to secede. It takes a position of neutrality officially. And here, Lincoln now suspends habeas corpus in Maryland and begins to arbitrarily arrest suspected secessionists, including the mayor and the police chief of Baltimore. This leads to a clash between Lincoln and the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice Taney. Taney orders the Union Army commander in Maryland to bring the prisoners before him. In other words, an order of habeas corpus. The commander refuses, citing Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. Taney rules that a president cannot suspend the habeas corpus. Only Congress can. Lincoln ignores the Supreme Court justice's ruling, and he even considers arresting Taney, except his cabinet kind of talks him out of it. And so gradually and reluctantly, Maryland is going to be co-opted into the Union, while some of its more hardcore secessionists will remain in prison until they're released somewhere in December of 1862. In Missouri, there, a mini civil war erupts between pro-South and pro-North forces. The Civil War in Missouri is almost a completely different history of its own. Eventually, pro-Union forces will prevail in Missouri, and there's a bitter guerrilla war led by William Cantrell, Bloody Bill Anderson, and George Todd, Jim Cole, Jim Younger. These figures, of course, these guerrilla fighters will become the ones that survived the Civil War, will become the stuff of legend, like, the Clint Eastwood movie, The Outlaw Josie Wales, is based on these guerrillas who continue essentially becoming, after the war, continue to lead their kind of outlaw life. They never, some of them will never retake the oath of allegiance to the United States. Some, as I say, will become outlaws. They will become a whole mythology of the United States, including, of course, the figure of Jesse James. Jesse James is one of these former guerrilla outlaws that will just go on into the 1880s, if I'm not mistaken, another 20 years. There he is, Jesse James with his brother Frank James. That's the real Jesse James. That's the movie Jesse James. Brad Pitt played him in the most recent movie, The Assassination of Jesse James, by the coward Robert Ford. Kentucky, like Missouri, Kentucky attempts to remain neutral too. Although, again, the state will eventually be co-opted into the Union, like Missouri. Lincoln smartly gives Kentucky tacit recognition as a neutral state. He even allows it to supply horses, food, and leather, and even munitions to the Confederates without making a big issue of it. And this kind of forbearance will work in Lincoln's advantage. And so gradually Union forces in Kentucky become militantly pro-Union. And the next state election, after the war breaks out, a Union government is elected there. And Kentucky leaves its neutral stand and eventually, as I say, will become a Union state. This leaves Delaware right there. Delaware is officially a slave state, but it has actually few slaves and is a supporter of the Union. And so with Maryland remaining in the Union, now what you are looking at is the final lineup of Confederate states versus Union states. And that is essentially the lineup for the rest of the war.